The summer heat bore down mercilessly on the bustling bus station in Montgomery, Alabama. It was 1961, and Private James Thompson stood tall in his pristinely pressed military uniform, a ticket clutched firmly in his hand. His heart was light with thoughts of finally returning home after 18 months of service, eager to hug his mother, taste her famous peach cobbler, and sleep in his own bed again. The station buzzed with the usual afternoon crowd. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, businessmen checked their watches impatiently, and elderly couples sat quietly on wooden benches, fanning themselves with folded newspapers. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel and cigarette smoke, mixing with the sweetness of magnolia trees blooming nearby. Thompson adjusted his duffel bag on his shoulder, feeling the weight of his medals against his chest. He'd earned them protecting the very freedoms that seemed to stop at this bus station's doorstep. With quiet determination, he joined the line for the Greyhound bus headed north. His first-class ticket had cost him extra, but he'd wanted to travel comfortably after such a long time away. As passengers began boarding, Thompson handed his ticket to the driver, a man with weathered skin and hard eyes. The driver's gaze flickered between Thompson's face and his ticket, his expression darkening. "You must be confused," he said, his voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "First-class seating is in the front, your seat's in the back." Thompson's throat tightened, but his voice remained steady. "No, sir, there's no confusion. I purchased a first-class ticket. I have the right to sit in first class." His words were respectful but firm, just as his father had taught him, stand your ground, but keep your dignity. The driver's face reddened. "Listen here, boy," he spat, no longer bothering to keep his voice down. "I don't care what kind of ticket you bought or what uniform you're wearing. I said your seat's in the back." Other passengers had stopped to watch. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others stared openly at the unfolding scene. A young mother pulled her curious child closer, whispering something in his ear. The air in the bus seemed to grow thicker with tension. Thompson thought about all the times he'd faced similar situations, at diners, movie theaters, even walking down the street, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the weight of his uniform, or maybe it was simply that he'd had enough. He'd just spent months defending his country, watching fellow soldiers, black and white, bleed the same color red. "Sir," Thompson said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent bus, "I fought for this country. I served alongside men of all colors. We all bled the same, fought the same, and protected the same flag. This ticket says first class, and that's where I intend to sit." The driver's hand moved toward the radio, presumably to call for police assistance. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the tension building like a thunderstorm about to break. No one had ever seen anything quite like this at their local bus station, a soldier in full uniform, standing his ground with quiet dignity, challenging a system that everyone knew was wrong but few dared to question. What happened next would change not just Thompson's life, but the lives of everyone on that bus. As the driver reached for his radio, a voice from the front of the bus broke through the heavy silence. A voice that would turn this ordinary bus ride into an extraordinary moment in civil rights history. Thompson stood steadfast, his heart pounding but his exterior calm. He thought about his mother's words before he left for service. "Remember who you are. Remember what's right." In this moment, he was doing exactly that, though he couldn't have known that his simple act of dignity would spark a chain of events that would ripple through their small southern town and beyond. William Harrison sat in his first-class seat, his briefcase positioned neatly beside him, watching the scene unfold. His suit, though expensive, felt uncomfortably tight in the growing tension of the bus. As a successful businessman, he'd witnessed countless injustices like this one, always telling himself it wasn't his place to get involved. But today felt different. The soldier's calm demeanor struck him deeply. He was a man who'd risked his life for their country, standing with quiet dignity as he faced the same prejudices he'd supposedly fought to defeat overseas. Harrison thought about his own son, about the same age as this soldier, who'd never had to fight for something as simple as a bus seat. The driver's voice grew louder, his threats more pointed. "I'm giving you one last chance to move to the back, or I'm calling the police." His hand hovered over the radio, knuckles white with tension. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably, some whispering among themselves, others pretending to be absorbed in their newspapers or looking out windows. An elderly woman in a floral dress clutched her purse tighter, her eyes darting between the soldier and the driver. A young boy, no more than 7, tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in that loud whisper children use, "Mama, why can't the soldier sit down?" His mother quickly shushed him, but the question hung in the air, its innocent logic cutting through the artificial barriers adults had built. Harrison felt something shift inside him. The weight of every time he'd stayed silent, every injustice he'd witnessed but ignored, pressed down on his shoulders. He thought about his morning prayers, about treating others as you'd want to be treated, about what it really meant to be a Christian, a human being. The businessman's hands trembled slightly as he stood up. He wasn't used to making scenes. His success had partly come from knowing when to keep quiet. But he couldn't stay silent anymore. Not today. Not with this soldier who'd served their country standing there in his pressed uniform, being treated like he was less than human. "Driver," Harrison's voice came out stronger than he expected, drawing every eye on the bus. "I'd like to give up my seat." The driver turned, clearly surprised to see one of his regular passengers speaking up. "This man has more right to sit here than I do. He's defended our country while we sat safely at home." The bus fell silent. Even the constant hum of conversation that had been buzzing in the background stopped. Harrison continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. "I've ridden this bus every week for the past 15 years. I've watched good people be forced to sit in the back, and I've been part of the problem by staying quiet. Not anymore." He turned to address the other passengers, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. "Look at his uniform. Look at those medals. While we went about our daily lives, he and countless others like him were fighting for our freedoms. What kind of freedom are we giving him in return?" The driver's face reddened further. "Now listen here, Mr. Harrison. Don't go making trouble. You know the rules same as everyone else." "Rules?" Harrison's voice took on a new strength. "I know about rules. I write contracts for a living. But I also know about right and wrong. And this is wrong." He picked up his briefcase and stepped into the aisle, gesturing to his seat. "This man paid for a first-class ticket, just like I did. He deserves to sit here more than any of us." The tension in the bus shifted. What had started as a confrontation between a soldier and a driver had become something larger, a moment of conscience that forced everyone present to examine their own role in maintaining an unjust system. Some passengers began to nod in agreement, while others looked down at their hands, perhaps wrestling with their own thoughts and beliefs. Harrison stood firm in the aisle, his usual carefully maintained business persona stripped away, revealing simply a man trying to do what was right. He didn't know it then, but his decision to stand up that day would ripple far beyond this single bus ride, touching lives in ways he couldn't imagine. The unexpected support from William Harrison sent ripples through the bus. The air, already thick with tension, now crackled with possibility. Private Thompson stood straighter, if that was even possible, his eyes meeting Harrison's with quiet gratitude. But this was just the beginning of what would become an extraordinary chain of events. An elderly woman in the third row slowly rose from her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her worn leather purse. "My Bobby," she said, her voice quavering but growing stronger with each word. "He served in the Pacific, never came home." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Every time I see a soldier in uniform, I think of him, and I know he'd be ashamed of us today." The driver shifted uncomfortably, his earlier certainty beginning to crack. "Ma'am, I don't make the rules. I just follow them." "Rules?" A middle-aged man in overalls spoke up from his seat. "I work at the factory with men of all colors. We share lunch, we share work, we share worry about our families. But we can't share a bus seat. It don't make sense anymore." Harrison stepped closer to Thompson, his voice carrying through the bus. "I've spent my life building a business, making deals, shaking hands with people who look just like me. But you know what? Some of the bravest men I've ever met don't look like me at all. They wear uniforms like this gentleman here, and they fight for all of us, regardless of what we look like." A young woman, clutching schoolbooks to her chest, stood up next. "I teach history at the local high school," she said softly. "Every day, I tell my students about democracy and freedom. How can I look them in the eye tomorrow if I sit here silently today?" The atmosphere on the bus had transformed. What started as one man's stand had become something larger, a moment of collective conscience. Even those who remained silent seemed to be wrestling with their thoughts, their eyes moving between Thompson Harrison and their own reflection in the bus windows. A small boy, no more than 6, tugged at his mother's dress. "Mama," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. In Sunday school, they said Jesus loves everybody the same. His mother's face flushed, but she didn't shush him this time. Instead, she looked up at Thompson with tears in her eyes. The driver wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. The radio at his side remained untouched now, his threats about calling the police forgotten in the face of this unexpected unity. He looked out the window, perhaps hoping for someone to tell him what to do next, but found only his own reflection staring back. Thompson spoke for the first time since Harrison's intervention. His voice was clear and steady, carrying no anger, only purpose. "All I want is to sit in the seat I paid for, to ride home with the same dignity I fought to protect overseas. Is that really too much to ask?" Harrison placed a hand on Thompson's shoulder. "No, sir, it's not too much to ask at all." He turned to address the driver again. "We're not leaving until this man gets his rightful seat. And I have a feeling I'm not the only one willing to wait." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the bus. An older gentleman in a business suit checked his watch, then deliberately settled back in his seat, making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. A woman with grocery bags arranged them more comfortably at her feet, preparing for a long wait if necessary. Outside the bus, a small crowd had begun to gather. Word had spread about what was happening, and curious onlookers pressed their faces against the windows. Some held newspapers, others pointed and whispered. This simple bus ride was becoming something bigger, a moment when ordinary people decided they'd had enough of accepting what they knew was wrong. The next few minutes would prove crucial. The driver's decision, the passenger's resolve, and Thompson's quiet dignity would all play their parts in what happened next. But one thing was already clear. This was no longer just about a bus seat. This was about people finding their voices, about the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. Word spread through the bus station like wildfire. People who had been hurrying to their destinations now slowed, then stopped, drawn to the strange sight of a bus that should have departed 15 minutes ago. The afternoon sun beat down on the growing crowd outside, their faces pressed against the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. A young newspaper boy, his bag still full of the day's editions, dropped his papers and ran to the phone booth. Within minutes, a local reporter arrived, notebook in hand, straightening his tie as he pushed through the crowd. The story was too good to ignore. A decorated soldier, a businessman's stand, and a bus full of people choosing sides. Inside the bus, the air conditioning struggled against the heat of bodies and tension. The driver's uniform was dark with sweat now, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. He'd never faced anything like this in his 15 years of driving. Usually, people just did what they were told. A well-dressed woman in her 50s spoke up from her seat near the middle of the bus. "My husband runs the corner store," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "Every morning, soldiers from both sides of town come in for coffee. Their money's the same color, their service to our country's the same value. Why should this bus be any different?" Her words sparked something in another passenger, a factory worker with rough hands and tired eyes. "Yesterday," he said, "a colored man saved my life at the steel mill. Pulled me back just before a beam fell. Didn't think twice about it, and here we are, arguing about where somebody can sit." The crowd outside had grown larger. Someone had brought a camera, its flash occasionally lighting up the interior of the bus. Through the windows, passengers could see people pointing, talking, some nodding in approval, others shaking their heads in disapproval. This wasn't just a bus delay anymore. It was becoming a moment that would be remembered. Private Thompson stood quietly through it all, his posture perfect, his face composed. He'd faced worse in combat, but somehow this battle felt just as important. Harrison remained by his side, his briefcase forgotten on his seat, his usual schedule completely abandoned for something he now realized mattered much more. A boy about 12 years old had been watching everything with wide eyes. He tugged at his older sister's sleeve and whispered, but in that loud way children do, "Isn't he a hero? Why can't heroes sit wherever they want?" His sister tried to quiet him, but his words had already rippled through the bus, making several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The station manager appeared outside, his face red from running. He gestured frantically for the driver to open the door. When it hissed open, the sounds of the crowd flooded in, murmurs, discussions, and even a few encouraging shouts. "There's already calls coming into the office," the manager said, wiping his brow. "The newspaper's here, and someone said they called the TV station." The driver looked desperately at the manager. "What should I do? We're already behind schedule." "Behind schedule?" Harrison spoke up again. "We're behind a lot more than a schedule. We're behind the times themselves. While this brave man was fighting for our country, we were stuck in the past. Maybe it's time we caught up." An elderly man who had been quietly watching everything unfold finally spoke, his voice gravelly with age but firm with conviction. "I fought in the Great War," he said. "Had a colored soldier save my whole unit. Never got to thank him proper because of rules like these. Well, I'm tired of rules that don't make sense." The story was taking on a life of its own. Outside, someone had started singing a hymn, soft at first, then growing stronger as others joined in. The sound drifted through the bus's open door, adding an almost spiritual quality to the scene. Inside, passengers who had never spoken to each other were now engaged in deep conversation, sharing stories, questioning long-held beliefs. The atmosphere had shifted from tension to something else, something like hope mixed with uncertainty. Everyone on that bus knew they were part of something important, something that would be talked about in homes and shops across town for weeks to come. The question now wasn't just about where one soldier would sit, it was about what kind of community they wanted to be. The station manager paced back and forth outside the bus, his shoes clicking against the pavement. Inside, the air had grown thick with anticipation. The crowd outside had swelled to over 50 people, and a TV news van had just pulled into the parking lot, its antenna reaching toward the sky like a metal tree. The driver sat slumped in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. He'd been driving this route for years, following the same rules day after day. But now, those rules felt as heavy as chains around his neck. He looked at his watch again. They were 30 minutes behind schedule, the longest delay he'd ever had. "I've got other buses backed up," the station manager called through the open door, his voice strained. "We need to resolve this now." He glanced nervously at the growing crowd and the news crew setting up their camera. Private Thompson hadn't moved from his spot, standing straight and dignified in his uniform. The medals on his chest caught the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, sending little flashes of light across the bus interior. Harrison stood beside him, his suit jacket now draped over his arm in the warmth, but his resolve unchanged. An older gentleman in the back of the bus stood up slowly, using his cane for support. "I've lived in this town my whole life," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Seen a lot of things change, and a lot stay the same. Maybe it's time for another change." He made his way carefully to the front of the bus, each step deliberate. When he reached Thompson and Harrison, he turned to face the driver. "Son, sometimes doing your job means knowing when the rules are wrong." The driver looked out at the crowd again, then at the TV camera now pointed at the bus. He could see his own reflection in the windshield, tired, sweaty, and suddenly very small in his uniform. His hands fell away from the steering wheel as something inside him seemed to give way. "I just drive the bus," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then, louder, turning to Thompson, "Take any seat you want, sir. I'm sorry for the trouble." A collective breath seemed to release throughout the bus. Someone in the back started to clap, and soon others joined in. The sound swelled, filling the bus with something that felt like hope and victory and change all rolled into one. Thompson moved with quiet dignity toward the first-class section, Harrison right beside him. As they settled into their seats, an elderly woman across the aisle reached over and patted Thompson's hand. "My grandson's in the service too," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you for helping make his world a little better today." The driver started the engine, its rumble mixing with the continued applause. Outside, the crowd began to disperse, but not before many of them smiled and waved at the bus windows. The news crew was interviewing people in the parking lot, their camera catching the final moments of what would become a significant story in local civil rights history. As the bus finally pulled away from the station, conversations buzzed throughout the cabin. People who had never spoken to each other before were now sharing stories, exchanging names, and discussing what they'd just been part of. The usual invisible barriers between passengers had dissolved, replaced by a shared sense of having witnessed something important. Harrison turned to Thompson, extending his hand. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," he said with a warm smile. "I'm William Harrison." Thompson shook his hand firmly. "James Thompson, Private First Class," he replied, a slight smile breaking through his composed expression. "Thank you for standing up back there." "No," Harrison said, shaking his head. "Thank you for serving our country and for helping us serve our conscience today." As the bus rolled through the streets of their changing town, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows. Those shadows showed no difference between the passengers. They were all just people sharing a ride and a moment in history that would be remembered long after the bus reached its destination. The story of what happened that day would spread beyond the bus, beyond the town, becoming part of a larger narrative about change and courage. But for now, the passengers simply sat together, the usual boundaries forgotten, as the bus carried them toward home and toward a future that felt just a little bit different than it had that morning. The morning after the bus incident, the local newspaper's front page carried the headline, "Soldiers Stand Sparks Change." Below it was a photograph of Private Thompson and William Harrison sitting side by side in the first-class section, their faces captured in a moment of quiet triumph. The story spread like wildfire through the town, passed from neighbor to neighbor, discussed over morning coffee and dinner tables. The bus company's office found itself flooded with phone calls. Some were angry, demanding the driver be fired. Others were supportive, praising the company for eventually doing the right thing. The company's president, a man who'd always tried to avoid controversy, sat in his office staring at the mounting pile of messages on his desk. At the local diner, the usual breakfast crowd huddled over their newspapers, pointing at the photos and sharing their own versions of what they'd heard. The waitress, who'd served the same faces every morning for years, noticed something different today. People who normally sat apart were now sharing tables, drawn together by the need to discuss what had happened. "My cousin was there," one customer said, stirring his coffee. Said it was the quietest protest he'd ever seen. No shouting, no violence, just a soldier standing up for his rights and people finding their conscience. The driver had called in sick that morning, but not because he was ill. He sat at his kitchen table, reading and rereading the article, thinking about what he'd been part of. His wife found him there, still in his bathrobe at noon, lost in thought. "You know," he finally said to her, "I've been driving that route for 15 years, never questioning the rules. Yesterday made me realize how many times I could have done things differently." At the high school, the history teacher who'd been on the bus found her students more engaged than ever. They peppered her with questions about what she'd seen, what it felt like to be there. Sometimes, she told them, history isn't just something in your textbooks. Sometimes it happens right in front of you, and you have to decide what part you're going to play in it. The bus company's president finally emerged from his office late that afternoon with an announcement. The company would be reviewing all its policies, starting with seating arrangements. "We can't change the past," he told reporters, "but we can decide what kind of future we want to build." Private Thompson's mother's house became an unexpected gathering place. Neighbors who'd never visited before brought pies and casseroles, not just to welcome her son home, but to thank him. They'd found him in the front yard, still in his uniform, telling stories about his service to a group of wide-eyed children from the neighborhood. Harrison's law office received calls from other businesses in town, asking for advice on how to handle their own integration policies. He'd never planned to become an expert in civil rights law, but he found himself drawn to these cases, seeing them as a way to continue what had started on that bus. The elderly woman who'd first spoken up about her son, Bobby, received letters from other military mothers, both black and white. They formed a support group that met every Wednesday at the church, sharing stories about their children serving overseas and working together to send care packages to soldiers. The local radio station invited Thompson and Harrison to share their story. As they sat in the studio, the phones lit up with callers wanting to add their own voices. One caller, his voice trembling with emotion, said, "I was on that bus too. I didn't say anything, didn't do anything. But watching what happened changed something in me. Now I know silence isn't always golden, sometimes it's just yellow." The story reached the state capitol, where lawmakers began discussing broader changes to transportation laws. It wasn't an immediate transformation. Change rarely is, but it was a start, a crack in the foundation of segregation that would help lead to bigger changes. A month later, a small plaque appeared at the bus station. It didn't mention names or take sides. It simply read, "On this spot, courage met conscience, and our community took a step forward." People would often pause to read it, some remembering that day, others learning about it for the first time, but all understanding that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. The soldier stepped up to the gate, ticket in hand, his chest swelling with pride and anticipation. After a long deployment overseas, he was finally heading home. And today, he decided to splurge on a first-class ticket as a special treat to himself. He had served his country with honor and felt he deserved a little luxury. But as he presented his boarding pass, the gate agent's face soured. "There must be some mistake," she said curtly, barely glancing at his ticket. "The first-class cabin is completely full. You couldn't possibly have a seat there." The soldier was taken aback, but maintained his composure. He politely explained that he had booked the seat himself and could see on the airline app that it was confirmed. He showed her his ticket again, pointing out his first-class seat number. But the agent wouldn't budge. Her irritation only seemed to grow at his persistence. Frustrated but still calm, the soldier asked if a manager could help clear things up. That's when the agent's demeanor shifted dramatically. She suddenly started speaking loudly, her voice dripping with disdain as she accused him of being aggressive and belligerent. The soldier was shocked. He hadn't raised his voice at all, but now a crowd was gathering, eyeing him suspiciously. Before he could process what was happening, airport security descended upon him. Firm hands gripped his arms as he was roughly pulled aside, his protests falling on deaf ears. He couldn't believe this was happening. Here he was, a man who volunteered to risk his life for his country, being treated like a criminal. Outrage and humiliation burned inside him as he sat detained in a cold holding room. Security handled his military ID and documents with clear suspicion, as if his years of decorated service meant nothing. Each minute felt like an hour as a deep sense of betrayal squeezed his heart. Is this what he got for his sacrifice? For his love of country? To be met with such disrespect and hostility? While stewing in a tempest of emotions, the soldier overheard a conversation that made his stomach turn. The gate agent who had denied his first-class seat had apparently used it to get her own friend on board instead. He couldn't believe his ears, and it got worse. Witnesses were now coming forward to complain about how poorly the soldier was treated. They made clear he never acted threateningly. It had all been an outrageous scene cooked up by a lying agent. After what felt like an eternity, the airline sheepishly released him. The records proved he had rightfully booked that first-class ticket. This whole ordeal had been a farce from the start. But now, as he slowly collected his belongings, the soldier felt no sense of vindication, only a deep weariness and emptiness inside. Word of his troubling tale began to spread like wildfire on social media. An airline employee concocting a scene to kick a black service member out of first class just to give the seat to her buddy. The story hit a national nerve. Outrage boiled over across the country. The president of the airline went into frantic damage control mode, firing the gate agent and announcing a major initiative to put all employees through advanced diversity training. But it was too little too late. Sitting at home at last, the soldier found himself adrift in a fog. He stared at his uniform hanging in the closet, once a shining symbol of his identity and purpose. But that crisp, proud veneer had been shattered, replaced by an ugly truth he had always known, but never fully absorbed, that for some people, the color of his skin would always matter more than his character, contributions, or courage. It was a gut punch he couldn't shake. But as the days passed, the soldier felt a small spark slowly building in his spirit. His pain and anger were morphing into something new, a sense of purpose, an unshakable resolve to stand up, speak out, and demand better. He would not let this wound define or destroy him. He would use it as fuel to make change. So the soldier began to share his story more widely, to connect with others who had experienced similar injustices. What had started as a humiliating personal offense soon became something much bigger, a national flashpoint and rallying cry. This soldier's voice joined a chorus of others demanding that America confront the reality that prejudice, suspicion, and unequal treatment were still an inescapable part of daily life for minorities, even those who served the nation in uniform. His story put a human face on issues that were too often brushed aside. And slowly but surely, his message began to resonate and inspire. His bitter experience became a spark that lit a fuse and ignited a renewed push for justice and equality. By channeling his private pain into public purpose, this soldier embarked on a new mission to ensure that the country he sacrificed for lived up to its sacred ideals for all. The journey ahead would be long, but he would march forward with hope in his heart, determined to make a difference with every step.